Okay, we get started. Thanks everybody for coming. And we're really happy to have Mark Churchland here from Columbia, and especially happy that he graciously decided to sort of stop over on his way to SFN business here for a day. So Mark, thank you.
Thank you so much. Oh, sorry. We need to turn this mic on. We don't even know if this mic works. All right.
Yeah.
The mic works. Is it too loud? Is it? Oh, wow. It's like changing. It's like dynamic.
No idea how to control it though.
Is it okay? I mean, I could like lower it slightly. Use 1 over R squared. All right. All right. Well, before I really get started, I just wanted to sort of throw up the names and the faces of the people that made the largest contributions to this work, and also to stress that the work was highly collaborative and had contributions from multiple labs. And because I'm here and because I know he's interested in a postdoc at Harvard, potentially here, I'm gonna give a particular shout out to Elam's work, who's on the far right there. And I actually had a talk that was principally Elam's work. And that sort of like, the latest unpublished stuff that in some sense I'm the most excited to talk about. But I decided to stick with the sort of more tried and true lecture that I'm going to give you today. But you'll sort of see a little bit of where we're heading with Elam's work at the very end of it. And I think I'm pleased with that sort of conservative choice, because a lot of people today in our meetings have been asking me these very philosophical questions, about how to think about networks mechanistically and relate that to data. And the talk is very much on that topic. So hopefully I made the right choice. If let's see, there's 1 seat there. There's 1, 2, 3 seats here. And then of course there's stairs. So, and there's 1 seat over there too. All right. So a major interest of our lab is how the motor cortex controls voluntary movement. And if you're a primate, and I'm going to hazard a guess that most of you are, then the motor cortex is more or less the most important area in your brain for producing voluntary movements of your body. And we're interested in questions like, what kind of a neural machine is motor cortex that it can do this? We know it creates descending commands that go fairly directly to the muscles, but how does it create those commands? And if we're going to ask these kinds of questions, well, like, good Lord, I'm pretty sure I turned that off. If we're going to ask these kinds of questions, more generally, like what's the right conceptual language for talking about neural machines that do things? So, movement is universal in the animal kingdom. It can and is and should be studied in a variety of species in order to sort of triangulate our understanding of the neural mechanisms that produce movement. We choose the rhesus monkey for a variety of very specific reasons, 2 of which are the monkey and the human share some peculiarities of the primate motor system. And additionally, monkeys are particularly trainable. If you can come up with a task that's sort of carefully designed to distinguish between, hypothesis A and hypothesis B, the chances are very good that you can train your animal on that task. And as a result, we use a variety of tasks in the lab. I'll show you just a few. This is a variant of a standard reaching task, except in this case, he's having to reach 2 sequences of 2 targets. This will come up again later in the talk. This is what we refer to as our Pac-Man task. So the monkey presses against an immovable handle. He doesn't even move, and he only presses forwards. And the reason he presses is the harder he presses, the higher this Pac-Man icon goes up the screen. And his job is to make Pac-Man intercept as many dots as possible. You guys are a great audience. That was the appropriate reaction. Yes, it would take you a fair bit of time to get as good as he is at this particular skill. This is our cycle. I'm going to turn off this. I can't turn off the sound. You're going to get to hear a lot of slurping because he's stopping on these little spots in order to get juice reward. When the landscape is green as it is now, it actually just changed to sort of a desert landscape. But when it's green, he has to cycle forwards to move forwards through the environment. And when it's a desert landscape, he has to cycle backwards in order to move forward. He's stopping in these little spots to get juice reward. Wow, that is really loud. Okay, we're just gonna roll with it. So on the right, we've done something kind of fun. We've disconnected the pedal from the task. The pedal actually doesn't do anything at all. All the motion through the world is now decoded from motor cortex in real time. It's our best guess based on the neural activity of what it is he's trying to do. And of course, if our guess were perfect, which it isn't, but it's pretty good, then he won't even know that the pedal isn't doing anything anymore, and he'll continue cycling along as usual. So, oh, we're missing something here. Something's not good. Oh yeah, no, it's good. Never mind. I'm wrong. We're where we need to be. So during these tasks, we record neural activity, as you might guess. So this is a couple dozen channels for about 100 milliseconds recorded from a neural pixel probe. You can see the little voltage deflections when spikes occur. And zooming out, one neural pixel probe can record from a lot of different channels. And then there's these little discrete events that have a particular shape and happen in a particular place. And so, for example, we know that those are 7 spikes that were all generated by the same neuron. And those spikes are the main thing that we're going to end up analyzing. So this is older data. So here, each line is a neuron, and there's only about 200 lines because there's less data than we would record now. And what we're doing in this movie is based on neural activity now, which is the right-hand side of this movie, and neural activity in the past, but not the future. We're decoding his angular velocity. And you'll see he's either stopped or he's cycling forward for different durations. In a little bit, you'll see he turns around and starts cycling backwards, and we can decode that as well. And all of this decoding is being subserved by the abstraction that you see on the left there. And in fact, whenever that dot is on the orange track, we know he's cycling backwards. Whenever it's on the purple track, we know that he's cycling forwards. So, some of you will be very familiar with this kind of perspective on neural activity. Some of you will not. That is just fine. For now, just sort of treat it like art. But hopefully that will not be true by the end of the talk, because this abstraction is really going to be the topic of today's talk. And it contains a few different components / assumptions. And the first is there exists something worth calling a neural state that's described in a space of what I'm going to refer to as factors. So each factor is an axis, in this case, 3 dimensions of this space. Computation is performed at the level of the factors. And therefore, factors are the right way to understand the mechanism by which the network performs the computation of interest. So the claim is really going to be that mechanistic understanding is harder to get if you concentrate solely at the level of neurons and spikes, and easier to glean if you're willing to additionally consider this level of factors. So why use an abstraction, right? We all know what neurons and spikes are. Can't we just have our explanations be in terms of those elements? And the answer I'm going to claim is that this is an instance of a broader phenomenon, which is abstractions can be scientifically necessary when you're trying to understand mechanisms. Sometimes you really have no choice. Now, this is not always true, right? We can understand the monosynaptic stretch reflex perfectly well, spike by spike and neuron by neuron, and we can say that we understand it mechanistically because we can follow the flow of causality, right? From the stretch receptors into the cord, across the single synapse, and back out again to the muscles. And for small, real and artificial networks, that's typically true, right? We can understand how this simple feed-forward network does its job by following causality, neuron by neuron, and connection by connection. But for larger networks, more complicated tasks, and especially for recurrent networks, this gets challenging. So consider a network might be a network that performs a motor function. It takes a simple sort of command input that says, do the thing now, and it produces some interesting pattern of outgoing temporally structured activity, like maybe could drive a muscle. So causality will flow through such a network in the usual way, sure, but it also sort of bounces around inside through these recurrent connections in ways that are sort of difficult for traditional sort of, human understanding to fully comprehend. And to make matters worse, if this is a real network or a realistic spiking network, even across nominally identical repetitions of the same behavior, the same computation, the pattern of spikes from each neuron will be fairly different, which means that even if you could understand things spike by spike on trial 1, you'd have to partly start over again on trial 2. So we're going to need some kind of abstraction, we think, above the level of the spikes. And fortunately, we're used to that in science, right? In fact, I'd put it to you that you're very used to it, even in the case of neuroscience, right? You have no problem taking the stochastic openings and closings of thousands of channels, each behaving probabilistically, and summarizing them with a single well-behaved number, right? The conductance of that channel type. And you have no problem taking multiple such conductances and using them to understand the action potential, right? So we need 1 to know what the potassium channels are doing. We need 2 for sodium, right? Because they can inactivate. They then determine the membrane voltage, which is itself an abstraction, right? Tells you something about where the ions are living at this particular moment. And then the membrane voltage tells you what the channels are going to do at the next time step, right? And we can say that we understand this mechanistically because we can follow the flow of causality around this loop. And all of us were forced to do this when we were graduate students, I hope. So notice that we're using 4 numbers here to describe a much higher dimensional system, and that's very useful. So 4 numbers is sort of the least that you need to do a good job. But it turns out, and people discovered this decades ago, even 2 is can be okay under some circumstances. And 2 is nice because it fits on a page. And so here we have a sort of a single number that's summarizing the overall conductance state on the vertical axis, voltage on the horizontal axis. And the kind of cool thing now is these equations, which honestly are pretty hard to understand, right? Yeah, it'd take you a while to work through the implications of those things. The causation implied by those equations is now just reduced to these little green arrows in state space, which I find a lot easier to understand, right? If you know what your current voltage and membrane conductance combination is now, you know from those little green arrows where it's going to be heading in the future, and you can understand how a spike occurs and then how a spike then resets. So the claim here is that this abstraction is a simpler way of understanding things. You don't want to ever forget that there's ion channels lying underneath there, but it's really nice to have this as well. But of course, it's only simpler once you get used to it. But that's okay. We're smart people. We can get used to things. So the idea of describing the evolution of physical systems is in a state space, of course, has a very old history in the physical sciences, dating back a couple hundred years. If anybody knows the earliest example, please tell me, because I'd like to put it in the talk in the future. But it has a fairly old history even in neuroscience, especially, or at least in computational neuroscience. And by about the sort of mid-2000s, some sort of computational pioneers were expressing hypotheses about how neural computations were performed by building models and analyzing how the models do things using this format. And around the same time, experimentalists, a few of us at least, started plotting data in this way. And often it was just a convenient way of summarizing the activity of a lot of neurons in sort of a simpler way. But more and more, it became a way of expressing hypotheses that would have been difficult to express in any other way. And without going into any details, at the bottom left, you can see a hypothesis that Christian and I proposed in 2006, and 4 years later, this little movie shows you an experimental test of this hypothesis. A brief aside just to say, these factors get estimated in a lot of different ways, right? You might use principal component analysis, you might use factor analysis, you might use, there's a slew of methods, most of them closely related, but they all have the same goal, which is to take data and estimate these underlying factors. And a real hope or a real perceived benefit of this approach is that the factors can be compared between data and network models that propose to be hypotheses about the underlying computation that data is thought to reflect. So here's data plotted in this format, and here's data from network models plotted in the same format. And the idea is if you get a good match, you go, hoo-hoo, maybe I'm right. You know, I'm going to keep going with that hypothesis. If you don't get a good match, you know you're wrong. The hypothesis needs to be fixed in some way. And so the hope really is that this provides a bridge between the biological and computational levels and allows for hypothesis testing. And for that reason, this is now one of the most widely used abstractions in systems neuroscience. But there is still a lingering sense of maybe discomfort, maybe we're just not used to it yet, maybe uncertainty that many of my, especially more biologically inclined colleagues have expressed to me, you know, especially after a beer or two. And, you know, and I don't think they're entirely wrong. I think it is the right moment to sort of ask ourselves, like, you know, how much can we really trust this abstraction? I mean, what is a factor really anyway? I mean, God forbid we're just playing mathematical games in state space, right? We really hope we're not doing that, right? What we really hope is that this abstraction is the right way to get at mechanism, maybe not in all networks, but at least in a large class of biologically relevant spiking networks. And one reason to be a little concerned is that at the moment, factors are nearly always a thing that's measured from data, and they're defined statistically, not mechanistically, right? So here's a classic example of a statistical definition of a factor. You've got these latent factors, you don't get to observe them. They're hidden. That's why they're called latent, right? Through a bunch of weights, they determine the firing rates of individual neurons, right? But you don't get to see those things either. What you actually get to see are these spikes that are probabilistically produced by the rates. The rates just give you the probability of spiking. But for a given rate across many trials, you'll get rather different patterns of spikes, okay? And this is a good statistical model. I've used it myself. I like it. But mechanistically, it's completely messed up, right? Like it says that there's these factors. Where are they? Like, are they living out somewhere in the ether somewhere? And they give the neuron something called an underlying firing rate that determines via kind of a coin flip whether the neuron's going to spike at that exact moment. Like, what is that underlying firing rate? Is it the membrane voltage? Like, it's not, right? The membrane voltage determines very deterministically whether the neuron is going to spike, right? So somehow we need to flip this around and understand what factors really are in terms of mechanistically generated spikes. So to do that, we're going to take a simplified model, but a mechanistic model of a single neuron. So it's going to get inputs, they get multiplied by synaptic weights, they get summed up, there's a threshold, and then you sort of leakily integrate those inputs, and if you cross the threshold, you spike, right? We could have used fancier Hodgkin-Huxley neurons if we wanted, it just would have made all the simulations take 40 times as long. So the key is that we haven't built in any factors, any underlying firing rates, and there's no little coin flipping machine inside here, right? This is a deterministic model. And we're going to create networks of many such neurons that are interconnected, and we're going to train them to perform sort of simple versions of interesting neuroscience tasks. And that's actually pretty tricky to do, or at least historically it was tricky to do in spiking networks. But there's a lot of good prior art on doing this, and we're going to leverage that And on top of that, we're going to introduce a training method that's particularly powerful, works particularly well, precisely because it makes explicit the centrality of the factors. So it's been known for a long time, if you take a bunch of neurons of the type I was just describing and you hook them up randomly in a big recurrent network, they will just burble along and produce spikes. And the spikes will look very random. They are not random. There's no noise in this. This is just deterministic chaos. But for all intents and purposes, kind of random, right? So, but that's not what we want, right? We want our network. I mean, that's kind of okay, because to some degree, that's what real neurons look like. But they do more than that, right? Like we need our network to actually perform a task. So we're going to take this matrix of initially random weights. I want you to stare at it, because I'm going to make a change. There's a subtle change in those connection strengths. And now this is the change that allows the network to perform the task. So let's just examine it. Forget about the random component just for a moment. We're going to simplify this using what's now a pretty standard trick, so that we don't have to deal with, potentially millions of numbers. We're going to consider this to be the product of two simpler matrices, okay? You don't have to do it this way, but it definitely simplifies things. So one of those will be a n, where n's the number of neurons, times something small. I'll just go with 2 for now matrix, and then the other would then be a 2 by n matrix, right? So that the math works out. Well, what does an n by 2 matrix tell you? Well, it tells you how you get linearly from n things to 2 things, where each of those 2 things is just a linearly weighted sum of the original n things, right? Great. What does the 2 by n matrix tell you? Well, it tells you how you get from those 2 things back to your n original things, right? So it won't surprise you at this point that I'm going to refer to those 2 sort of things that live in the middle of this bottleneck of the synaptic connectivity as factors, okay? And when we're done training, and admittedly, I'm not really telling you exactly how the training procedure works, so feel free to push me on that later. But when we're done training, when we've changed these weights, the activity of the individual neurons still looks in many ways pretty random. And single neuron responses are somewhat heterogeneous. No 2 neurons will look exactly the same. But these are realistic properties. That's really what cortex looks like. But critically, the factors, which each one is just a linearly weighted sum of the spikes of all of the neurons, most of that randomness just averages out and goes away. And the factors are these nice, well-behaved things. And they do repeat almost perfectly from trial to trial across repetitions of the same computation, okay? And there'll be a few of them. There won't be infinitely many. There'll be many fewer than there are neurons, but there'll be, a small or large handful of these. So why does this work, right? The easiest way for me to understand it is the following, right? We've got these factors. Each one's a weighted sum of spikes that has this lovely property of being meaningful and well-behaved, right? Well, what does a neuron get from all of its other neurons, right? Well, each neuron's input is just a linearly weighted sum of the spikes of all the other neurons, right? So there's many such weighted sums. Many of them just look like noise because the neurons are very noisily spiking. But there are a few weighted sums that are very meaningful, right? And so the factors are just a basis set for the meaningful component of every neuron's synaptic input, right? Every neuron gets a bunch of noisy stuff plus some weighted sum of the factors. And that gives it effectively a firing rate, right? It doesn't tell, the factors don't tell you for sure when it's going to spike, but when the factors are high, it's more likely, the randomness of all that's always going on in the background is more likely to push it across threshold and make it spike. So this neuron now effectively has a firing rate determined by the factors, and so do all the other neurons. Now they're noisy, but again, you average them all together, the noise goes away. In a network of sufficient size, the noise is not a problem. And around we go. So that means we can think of causality somewhat differently in these networks. Traditionally, right, we always think of causality the following way. The neurons have a certain activity level that gets pushed through their recurrent connections and determines their activity on the next time step. But if that's a loop, who's to say where a loop begins and ends? I mean, you're within your rights to decide, I think the factors are primary. right? The factors have two values at this particular moment in time. We're going to go around this loop through this big pool of neurons, and that's going to then tell me what my factor values should be at the next moment in time. Well, why would you do that? Well, by now you all have anticipated the answer, right? Instead of describing this network's computation in terms of hundreds or thousands of noisily spiking neurons, I can describe it in terms of just two well-behaved factors, right? And these little green arrows correspond to something pretty straightforward, which is that we all know that recurrent, or actually in this case, you could think of it almost as a feed-forward network. They're very good function approximators, right? So what these green arrows are is just a function in two-dimensional space. They say, if you're here now, this is where you're going next, right? So we've now reduced causality down to these little green arrows in state space that tell us if this is our factor state now, this is what our factor state will be at the next moment in time. And if some annoying experimentalist comes in and optogenetically perturbs us, well, hopefully the little green arrows will set up appropriately and they will bring us back on track. And once you realize that you can think of causality in these networks, oh, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. And in fact, somebody asked me this question over lunch today, and I thought it was a very good one, right? Like, are these factors real? Well, I mean, they're not as real spikes in real neurons, right? But then pressure ain't as real molecules bouncing around, but it sure feels real enough once you get used to it. So I think, and this was more or less where the lunchtime conversation went, the real questions are they well defined, right? And are they the right way to understand how the network performs its job? And if those things are true, they're real enough for present purposes. And indeed, for many networks, once you get used to thinking of causality in terms of these little green arrows, you realize, there's a lot of canonical computations that can be readily built in this way. So for example, suppose that I want to integrate noisy information to a bound in order to make a decision. Classic, Shadlin-Newsome style neuroscience task. Well, I can build a line attractor with these little green arrows, have something interesting happen at the edges such that I integrate information. And when I'm finally reasonably sure of my answer, I hit the bound and do something. I can create a fancier version of this, which is also something that's been suggested in the literature, where now I'm going to integrate the noisy information, but there's also this sense of urgency as I flow upwards. And at some point, even if I'm not sure, I'm going to be forced to make a decision. And so this would be sort of decision-making under pressure. And we can get these networks to perform, pretty much any task, even pretty complex tasks that a recurrent network of rate-based neurons could perform. So for example, in this case, the network's getting very simple inputs, just tells it where a target is and when it should actually go. And it has to generate these complex time-evolving patterns of activity, which were the real patterns of muscle activity that I recorded from a real monkey. And when we're all done with the training, which is actually very fast, it takes like 30 seconds, the network nicely recapitulates the real patterns of activity. Now they're a little noisy, but then again, so are the real patterns of muscle activity on an individual trial. So that's actually kind of realistic. And additionally, the activity of individual neurons looks very realistic, both at the level of the spiking. So these are sort of just the traditional raster plot shown at the top, the firing rate that an experimentalist might compute shown at the bottom. And if I were to give these data to another friend of mine that works in motor cortex and say, did this come from motor cortex or did this come from a model, they would have no idea, right? I wouldn't either if I didn't know that this actually is from a model. Okay, so the real hope, of course, is that we can use this understanding to do science, right? There's no other reason for it. So first, I'm going to give you an example of where the factors made it possible to formulate and test hypotheses that would have been probably almost impossible to do any other way. And we're in the middle of trying to address this old question, which is that if you perform a given set of sequences again and again and again over months or years, and you get really, really good at it, you become very facile, right? Very fast, very stereotyped, and very accurate. And so how do you do that? What's going on inside your head? The belief is or at least an interesting hypothesis, was that you take those multiple movements, 2, 3, 4, 5 movements, and you treat them sort of as one big movement, right? As sort of a holistic whole, right? And so now you don't have to have your motor cortex generate each of those individual movements. You could just generate one big long movement. And that's why, that's how you get so good at this. So we wanted to test this. We trained a monkey on a simplified version where all the sequences are just 2 reaches long. So he knows based on the color which one to do first and which one to do second. This is him in the middle of his training. You'll see there's a delay period. That's when the central point stays on. When that goes off, he has to execute his reach. Hopefully you can see he's pretty fast. He's going to get faster still by the time that he's done with his training. There's also a set of sequences that we show him every day, right? And by the time we're going to make the neural recordings, he's seen these like 10,000 times for each of these particular sort of 20 sequences that we give him every single day. This monkey's name is Balboa. He's currently retired in Texas. He looks pretty fluffy and happy with himself there. So Balboa got really good at this. So, you give him the go cue and boom, he goes straight to that first target. Velocity is very high. The reach is very brief. This is the muscle activity that goes along with the velocity. With nary a pause, he flips it right around, goes straight to the second target, right? So this is what the full velocity trace looks like. And you can see the muscle activity doesn't have like a pause or a plateau in there. It's essentially a continuous output, right? Which is pretty suggestive of this holistic strategy, right? That you just prepare the full sequence and then you execute the full sequence as one big movement. But we can't actually, based on behavior alone, rule out this alternative possibility, which is maybe he prepares the first movement, executes it, but he only prepared the first movement. So now he's got to prepare the second movement and then execute that. It doesn't seem super plausible because he has so little time for that second bout of preparation. He'd have to do it as the first reach was ending, but maybe we're good at that. Who knows? So we've got to look inside the brain. And our ability to test and distinguish between these two hypotheses leverages our prior understanding that there's 3 forms of activity in motor cortex in a task like this. The first is preparatory activity, which begins as soon as you know what it is you're supposed to do. The second is what I'm going to call trigger-related activity. It's pretty cool. Basically, what it does is it says, stop preparing and start actually moving. You can think of it as an internal neural go cue. And then, of course, there's the activity during execution itself. And for the purposes of brevity, I'm only going to talk about predictions related to the first 2. And even then, I'm only going to get to a subset of them, because that's actually all we're going to need. These 2 hypotheses make clearly different predictions, right? Holistic strategy says, one bout of preparation, you prepare the whole thing, and then there's one trigger signal to launch the whole sort of compound movement. The independent strategy says, no, 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 you've just got really good at making 2 movements really fast together. There'll be 2 bouts of preparation and then 2 trigger signals. So when we look at the level of single neurons, it's really hard to distinguish these hypotheses, like hard to the level of impossible. And I'll show you why. This is a firing rate of 1 neuron for a bunch of different conditions. So like the red, I think, was the up and then right reach. And then this would have been, say, a down and then up sequence. And this is all activity before the go cue is given. So clearly, there's a first bout of preparation, as one would expect. There's then execution-related activity related to the first reach, which begins with that little R1. And then there's execution-related activity related to the second reach. Is there a second bout of preparation in between them? Doesn't look like it, right? But like, how would you know? Because it'd be superimposed on top of all of this ongoing execution-related activity. And generally speaking, the responses of individual neurons, they're heterogeneous, they're complex. It is hard to discern the things that you need to discern. But at the level of the factors, things are a lot clearer. So for example, there exist preparatory factors that are only active during preparation. And I'll show you what one of them looks like during a single reach, right? It does something different depending on which reach you're going to make, which direction you're going to go. And then the preparatory factor just shuts down right before the reach begins with the little R symbol there. So what does this do during, oh, and this is the envelope of preparatory activity across all the preparatory factors, because there's more than one. What happens during a double reach? Well, it's actually super clear. You get 2 bouts of preparation, with the second one being very brief. And in fact, beginning before the first reach has ended. Okay, that's interesting. What about the trigger factor? I like the trigger factors. They're cool. They do the same thing for every reach. They're not saying go right, go left. They're just like, go now. They're highly predictive of the exact moment when he's going to begin the reach. And some really lovely work from Karl Svoboda's lab has manipulated this in ways that are utterly convincing that, yes, this really is the signal that launches execution. So what happens during a double reach? You get 2 trigger signals very, very clearly. So we had testable predictions. The predictions very clearly favor the independent strategy. So that is the clear winner. And though I didn't go into it, there's a large handful of additional predictions. All of the predictions of the independent strategy are correct. All of the predictions of the holistic strategy are wrong. That was not the answer we were expecting or even necessarily wanted, but it was the answer that nature gave us. And we were very happy with it once we adjusted, because this factor-based framework gave us the ability to instantiate what we really meant by a hypothesis and then to test it in data and to get a very clear answer. And in systems neuroscience, where things can often be kind of messy, to get all of these predictions are right, all of these are wrong, is pretty satisfying. So there's just really one more section to the talk, but it's a meaty one. But don't worry, I'll take care of you. Motor cortex sends about 1 million, well, cortex in general sends about 1 million axons down the spinal cord, activates about 50,000 motor neurons, which then activate the muscles. For a long time, because motor cortex has mono and disynaptic connections onto the motor neurons, people have been really interested in figuring out, well, what does the activity in motor cortex resemble? And there's been a lot of debate. And one camp argued that it encodes, even though it is not that far from the muscles, it's cortex. It's encoding some higher level variables like the direction of the reach, something more abstract. And another group argued, no, it's basically encoding muscle activity, which is the same as motor neuron activity, which under the right circumstances is closely related to force. And we really argued against both of these. Like we have really felt over the last 15-ish years that the neural activity did not agree with either of those. So when we look at neural activity during reaching, it does not look like kinematic parameters, but nor does it look like muscle activity. You can decode muscle activity from it, but the neural activity really doesn't look like muscle activity. And that's generally been true. But without getting into it, if you really wanted to, you could definitely doubt our conclusions. There's enough sort of complexities to these tasks, especially when you've got a moving arm. The biomechanics of a moving arm are pretty complex. And so, for example, muscle activity and force can look really, really, really different. And those things can really complicate interpretation. So we wanted a task where when we get an answer, there just should be very little argument. The right answer should just be staring us in the face, whatever that answer is. So the task we used was developed by Naja Marshall in the lab. And we call it the Pac-Man task. You saw it earlier. From the outside, it's the world's simplest task. He presses against an immovable handle. And he only ever pushes in one direction. He never even pulls. He only pushes. And the harder he pushes, the higher Pac-Man rises up a screen. As he leaves, eases off, Pac-Man instantaneously comes back down. Why would Pac-Man go up and down the screen? Well, of course, as you saw earlier, Pac-Man's got to eat dots. The more dots, the more juice. And now we can give different patterns of dots and get him to produce any pattern of forces that we like. Okay, so now I've Now we've got the sound on, and the sound's going to be a good thing, because I want you to listen to the activity of spinal motor neurons, which are being recorded down at the bottom. Now, we're not recording them from the spinal cord. We're leveraging the fact that every spinal motor neuron spike results in a spike of all the fibers it innervates. And we can sort those spikes. If you're very careful and you have a task that's isometric, you can sort those spikes. And you are effectively recording the spikes of spinal motor neurons because they're one-to-one. There's a handful of spinal motor neurons being recorded at the bottom, like maybe 3-ish. They're pretty boring. Just the higher force is, the more activity you're going to hear at the bottom. Okay? So a rather nice thing about this task is because of the biomechanical simplicity, muscle activity and force are actually almost perfectly related. The first PC of motor neuron activity is, correlates 0.9 something a lot with force. There's something else interesting going on here. And I wish I hadn't paused the movie right when I did, but you'll get the point anyway, which is that Pac-Man's height is just directly proportional to force. The height of the dots is just the desired force, right? Pac-Man's velocity is the derivative of force. Muscle tension is just directly, it's such a simple task. Everything's force or maybe the derivative of force. So that allows us to ask, does motor cortex activity resemble force? Well, let's look not at cortex. This is a motor neuron. And as you heard, and you'll also just have to trust me here, this red trace at the top looks pretty much just like force, okay? Here's an example motor cortex neuron. There's not really any canonical motor cortex neuron. They all look different from one another. They're all their own little snowflakes. And literally about 1 in 1,000 of them looks like force. This particular neuron is active for some conditions and not others, right? There's some where force is very high, but the neuron's completely silent. Here's another example. But its activity clearly does have something to do with force, right? It's not unrelated to it, but it certainly does not mirror force. And I want you to think about how weird this is, right? Like, these are neurons that are producing patterns of muscle activity. And yet the activity of the neurons doesn't particularly resemble, with some rare exceptions, the activity of the forces that are being generated, right? And this is sort of precisely why our field has had so much confusion over the years. And I'm going to put to you that actually there's a subtle but simple answer. If you're just willing to think in terms of what factor level mechanism would you need to produce an output of this type. So we're going to walk through that by thinking of a network that just involves 2 factors. And what I'm going to argue is that mechanistic constraints on what a network of this type can do and what it can't do, what it's impossible for the network to do. Those constraints are going to require the network's activity to look different from the outputs that it's going to create. Okay, so let's walk through that. This is some idealized output it's going to produce. There's going to need to be some combination of factors that whose sum is that output. So just to keep things simple, let's just say factor 1 is the factor that's going to feed the output. But then we've got some other factor as well. Okay, and then we've got some factor state, right? And then we need some flow field to guide the evolution of that state, right? And this is a good flow field, right? If we follow this around, right, we're going to go up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, and we're going to indeed generate the output pattern that we wanted, right? But keep in mind, factor 2 is doing something as well, right? And it's tracing out a different pattern that's not the output, right? And so that's sort of like the first hint. Ooh, there's going to be things going on inside these networks that aren't the output. But let's change our mind for a moment. Let's pretend, maybe we're an animal with 2 muscles. Maybe what factor 2 is doing is actually what we want our second muscle to do. Great, now we've got a network that's generating both muscles. Bob's your uncle. Okay, now our animal needs to do something different, and it needs to generate this pattern of activity for the first muscle. Okay, great, we'll just generate a flow field that gets that done. But wait a sec, there's a problem. This traces out a figure 8. The joint activity of these 2 muscles, right? this violates the whole idea of a flow field, because we're going to pass through the central point going one direction at one moment and a different direction at a different moment, right? And that's just something a flow field can't do, right? So I'm going to refer to this pesky little crossing point in the middle as a tangled point. Tangled points are bad, right? You need to avoid tangling if you're a network of this type, right? But of course, it's actually not hard. Some of you may have already intuited the answer. If this is the figure 8 in 2 dimensions, we just need to add a third dimension, right? And then we can separate out that tangled point while still having 2 dimensions be the output that we wanted, right? So we really just need to add a third factor. And when we do, note that from some views, especially if we've really reduced tangling by creating a lot of separation, from some views, the internal neural activity is going to be this big circle, even though the output is this figure 8. And keep circle in mind, because a circle is the least tangled rhythmic trajectory that can exist mathematically. And that gives us some predictions we really could have got from no other framework, which is neural trajectories in motor cortex should be a lot more circular than their corresponding muscle trajectories, and therefore have a lot lower tangling. Okay, so let's go test this. Do neural trajectories have lower tangling? Are they bigger circles? So this is data from cycling at a variety of different speeds. And across all those speeds, the muscle trajectories take on a variety of different shapes that are often highly tangled. The neural trajectories in the top 2 dimensions, these are just basically the top 2 PCs, do not. They're always this big circle. Now, the neural trajectories are a different shape for every speed. It's just most of that structure is not in the top 2 dimensions. Those top 2 dimensions are this big circle that maintains low tangling. So is that really right? If we quantify tangling in a lot of dimensions, is it actually lower, right? As the hypothesis would predict, is it lower for the neurons on the vertical axis than for the muscles on the horizontal axis? Well, this is one of these cases where you're like, wow, that worked out so much better than I would have ever thought, right? Like nature is not messy. Nature comes up with really good solutions. Motor cortex activity avoids trajectory tangling like the plague. And when we thought about it a little bit and ran some simulations, we realized that's actually reasonable. The lower tangling gets, you can separate a little bit and yeah, the network will work, but the lower tangling gets, the more noise robust the network becomes. And we assume that nature wants our motor networks to be very noise robust. So this is data from one monkey, just to drive home the point, different monkey, different patterns of neural and muscle activity, but it's the exact same result. We can move to different animals, different tasks, and this has been a generally consistent finding. So imagine for the moment that you didn't know any of that, right? And you're sort of a traditional neuroscientist from the sort of 60s through to the 90s. And you feel like these are your options, right? These are the hypotheses you get to pick between. Like number 2 is going to be looking pretty good when you look at these neural trajectories during cycling, right? Because they're a circle, right? What else is a circle? Well, like the actual trajectory of the physical hand, right? So like maybe it's a representation of that. Well, that makes a very clear prediction, right? Well, if this is what's happening during forward cycling, when we go to backward cycling, if it's a representation of either position or velocity, it's got to reverse, right? And I won't show you the data, but not only do the data not do that, they basically do the exact opposite of that. So then you'd be really confused. You're like, well, it seemed like a good theory, but it's like, what the hell is going on here, right? But at this point, with this conceptual framework in place, it's not confusing at all. It's exactly what you would expect, right? If the muscles have this angled geometry, right, the neural trajectories are going to be a disentangled version of that same geometry. Like hopefully that at this point makes perfect sense, that if this is what muscles look like, this is what neurons look like, even if the job of the neurons is to create that pattern of muscle activity, right? So, you would now favor this hypothesis. And, if I'm allowed a little fun speculation at the end, and also some people during the day, interestingly, were kind of asking me questions that were very much getting at these issues. This raises, as usual, right? Answers just beget more questions. Raises some interesting questions. Like you can do a lot of different things, not just cycle, but like there's a lot of things you learn to do over the course of your lifetime. Like In fact, as humans, we're sort of like extraordinary at that. Like, am I supposed to really believe that like these different skills are all like different kinds of factor dynamics living in my motor cortex, or maybe not? Maybe that's true, but maybe that happens upstream and like motor cortex is downstream of that. So how might this work? We've got some pretty cool data on this. I'm not going to drag you through the data in the interest of time. This is really Elam's project, and I have to say, like, that dude is amazing in like every respect. So think about what the neural trajectories look like during cycling, right? It's not one trajectory, it's really sort of a family of trajectories. And even though they look on top of one another in 2 dimensions, in more dimensions, they're not. They're actually spread out. As he cycles faster and faster, it looks like a stack of pancakes. So, the idea would be that this is a region of state space that has a particular flow field, right? And that flow field is good for this task. And you engage subtly different parts of that flow field depending on which variant of the task you're doing, right? But over the course of your life, you have created structure elsewhere in the flow field. There are other places you can go to perform other tasks, right? And so the claim, which I'm going to give with no data, and even if I had the data, you'd be like, oh, that's pretty compelling, but like that's the beginning of the story, not the end, and you'd be right. But the proposition I'm going to give you is that this is indeed how it works, right? That you go to different regions of state space, and indeed you're living in different neural dimensions, which I can't even really draw for you here, depending on these different tasks. And do I really believe if you learn to do something new, that creates a new part of state space where you can go to do that thing? Yeah, at least for the moment, that's going to be my best guess as to what's going on. And I'll just finish the last slide by just sort of like pondering, like, how useful, my central thesis really has been that this language that a bunch of us, kind of stole from computational neuroscience and thought might be useful and found useful, like it really has been. There have been hypotheses that we could construct and propose and prove or disprove using this language that would have been really difficult to do sort of any other way. So I won't belabor the conclusions here. I'll just throw them up. You can read them. They're kind of obvious. They're kind of probably in your head already. I guess the one thing I will say is I don't think that this abstraction is one size fits all, right? Like there will be other networks and other kinds of recurrent networks where the right abstraction is actually going to be kind of different. I don't think there'll be infinitely many. You're not going to need a different one for every brain area, but there's not going to be like the one ring to rule them all either, right? Like it seems to work really well in motor cortex, premotor cortex, I think a lot of prefrontal cortex, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily going to work in the hippocampus or the cerebellum. You might need a different form of abstraction to work there. And with that, I'll just thank all of you for your attention and happily take any questions. You want to moderate, or should I just randomly point it? All right, I saw a hand over there first. Yeah.
Wondering how this framework scales to longer lengths of time.
Yeah. I think, I mean, in general, I think the framework extends great to longer lengths of time. Abby had a paper, her first paper was the tangling paper. Her second paper was comparing motor cortex with supplementary motor area. And you might have noticed at the very beginning, there's pretty different distances between the targets when he's cycling. And in her original task, sometimes he only went half a cycle and sometimes he went up to 7, right? So there's a pretty broad range of distances there. And SMA keeps track of where you are in the whole long movement. And we could build models of this type, and they naturally found SMA solutions, SMA-like solutions, when they had to keep track of, like you would basically just tell the model, you're going to go 7 cycles, and it has to internally keep track of how many cycles it's done. Then you would get an SMA-like solution. If you built a model that had the luxury of being told, go now, and then it got a stop signal just before it was time to stop, those solutions looked like the motor cortex solution. So it looked like motor cortex was sort of looking ahead, at most about a cycle, and SMA was looking ahead as far as, I mean, there must be some limit, but as the full extent of what we explored in our task. At the same time, like sometimes it's nice to treat these systems as it's convenient to treat them as autonomous dynamical systems when you're analyzing the data, at which point you're basically saying, I think the inputs are changing slowly based on relative to the timescales I'm analyzing. And for experimental convenience, that might mean that sometimes your analyses might have to be limited to shorter periods of time, because to deal with longer periods of time, you might need to model the time varying inputs as well. Yeah, thank you.
Well, beautiful talk. And I totally buy the argument about the usefulness of factors. I actually, in some sense, you started with it sort of fighting against the intuition that some people might have that factors aren't really real.
Yeah.
But I actually kind of had the opposite intuition, which is that could it be any other way? I mean, you take any weight matrix, right? There's going to be some set of factors that describe it, right? So it seems like the more concrete hypothesis is that there's a small number of factors, right? But that's the part where I wasn't sure whether that's that's a claim that can be falsified based on the data that you have. Because if I've understood correctly, I mean, basically, for all these experiments, you're looking for a small number of things, and you find a small number of factors, right? Do we know if we look for many more things, we'd find many more factors, right? Is there really a small number of factors?
Yeah, I think it really depends on actually what you mean by the word small. So I think there's a great irony in the fact that because we use dimensionality reduction methods and because we embraced those early, that has led to a claim sometimes that things are really low dimensional, which is obviously true in some sense, right? Like I believe there are many fewer factors than there are neurons. So you're low dimensional in that sense. But part of what drove Krishna and I to reject dogma and go in search of something else, which took a while before, there's a lot of false starts along the way too, right? Was that the individual neurons in motor cortex were complex, I mean, which we were getting a particularly good look at given the tasks we had and the recording strategies we were using. We were characterizing the single neurons better than was typical. And we were really seeing that they were very complex and very heterogeneous. And the first papers really stressed their diversity, i.e. their high dimensionality, which we estimated as being in the 30s. And so, the network mechanisms that we were considering and still consider use a lot more factors than, say, a standard Georgopoulos model, which is effectively a 2-factor model. Or if you add speed in your Schwartz, it's a 3-factor model. And like we knew that wasn't going to cut it. There were dozens of factors. And I think we're realizing even more now, like there's a lot of factors. The Pac-Man task, because he's switching back and forth between a few different strategies, like one strategy when it's tracking slow things, a different strategy when he has to anticipate and sort of ballistically just commit to something, there's a lot of factors that are active. And some fall silent during some times and then wake up at other times. And you can almost see him internally switching back and forth between multiple subscales. And I think, if you think of like the vast repertoire that you have, how many factors are there going to be total? Thousands, presumably. So yeah, I do want to, I just wanted to clarify that I don't believe it's like some low 8-dimensional manifold or anything like that. Like things are actually pretty high dimensional. As far as like, how could it be any other way? Like I do think you can build recurrent networks that compute in a variety of different flavors. I mean, people built Sinfire chain-based recurrent networks. Like they don't have rates. They aren't described by factors. You would use a different abstraction to describe them. They've not historically been my favorite, but so yeah, I don't think it had to be the case. I do think you're right that it's a very natural way for many recurrent networks to work, which is sort of why the theoretical neuroscientists discovered it and we could borrow their ideas. But I don't think natural is quite the same as inevitable. Yeah, especially in a spiking network. Like it didn't have to sort of emulate these rate-based networks, right? Yeah, yeah. I don't know where to go. I'm going to go in the back because, yeah.
I was really, really curious about the concept of learning a movement so well that you don't even think about it.
Yeah.
What do you think about the importance of the factors that you currently as the monkey is the quicker you get a movement versus evolving to like not really thinking about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, like, you know, are there like factors up in your prefrontal cortex that are really active, like early on when movement feels effortful? And I mean, maybe that's a period in time when motor cortex needs a lot more inputs because it just doesn't have the right flow field on its own. And so it's requiring constant inputs from somewhere else. Whereas once you get really good at something, you can just give a brief input or maybe a static input or maybe a simpler input to motor cortex. And your factors up in prefrontal cortex can kind of quiet down and it feels less effortful. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer, but I like the question. Yeah. I'm gonna, okay. Right behind you, yes.
I was wondering, so if every individual neuron that you're recording from multiplexes the preparatory related
Yes,
activity and
yes,
trigger related activity,
yes.
and is it still possible to distinguish the two factors? If it is,
Yes.
could you give an intuition for
As to
how
why?
you get that distinction given the ground truth data is
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, great question. So let's assume every neuron, just for simplicity, let's say that we've got one preparatory factor and one execution factor, right? Keep things simple. Let's say every neuron's firing rate is determined by a random combination of those two factors, right? And we've got 1,000 neurons, right? Let's say that you are a downstream muscle, okay? And the muscle listens to every neuron, and it listens to that neuron in proportion to the strength of how much that neuron cares about the execution factor, right? So if you're a neuron and I'm a muscle and you have a large weight for the execution factor, I listen to you a lot. If you have a small weight, I don't listen to you very much at all. If you have a negative weight, there's a negative weight between me and you, right? So, and I'm listening to 1,000 neurons. Like, you would think, oh my God, all those neurons have preparatory activity. I'm a muscle. I'm going to have preparatory activity too. That's bad, right? Like, I don't want to have preparatory activity. But over 1,000 neurons, all that preparatory activity will average out because as many neurons are increasing as are decreasing, right? They're pretty symmetric. So if basically, even if every neuron is listening to both, if those weights are just randomly drawn, they live in different neural dimensions, like orthogonal or very nearly orthogonal neural dimensions. And if I choose to listen to one of those two signals in a large network, I will naturally ignore the other, i.e. the other one will fall in the null space of my readouts without me even having to put effort into that. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Okay, I feel like, okay, I saw you, and then we can go there, and then we can go there. Yes.
Exactly, did you train the spiking mechanism?
Ah, yeah. I used to have a slide in there. I should have left it in there so I could like pull it up now. It's a variant of, I'm wondering if I should go get the slide, both because it explains it better and it would jog my memory. I'm just going to do my best. And you can also come up and ask afterwards, and I will pull up the slide. The way you do it is you, okay. So it's a variant of force training. So what you do, we're only actually going to train these weights here, right? Okay. So at every moment in time, there's all of these neurons are spiking or not spiking, right? You just have a big vector S of ones and zeros, right? And your job is to create weights here such that these factors have the desired value, right? Well, you've got a lot of neurons, so there's actually many weights, right? At any one moment in time. It's just a regression problem that's like overcomplete, right? Like there's always a set of weights at that moment in time that will give you the instantaneous values of the factors that you want. So you just set the weights to be that, right? And then the factors go back into the network, and then you need to be able to do it at the next moment in time, right? And so the W you just picked won't be right? There's no way that the one that worked at the last moment in time, you're going to get lucky, is correct at this moment in time. So you have to update W again, such that based on this pattern of spikes, you get the correct factors. But as you keep updating those weights, you eventually end up settling on a set of weights that works for all spikes, such that every possible pattern of spikes that could occur in those neurons, you don't actually explore every possible one. You probably explore like 0.1% of all possible patterns, but you do end up with a pattern of weights that if these are the factors now, there's a whole bunch of possible patterns of spikes you could get. Those just need to be mapped onto the right factors at the next moment in time. And pretty quickly, you'd converge on a W. W is the weight matrix for those weights that makes that work. And actually, the training is very fast. It's not like backprop or something like that. Like it occurs, you could train in 10 or 100 seconds. And you could watch the network running while you do it. And then once those weights are stabilized, you don't ever change them again. They're then just fixed. And it ends up working because the noise of the spiking actually means that you're always exploring around your little trajectory. And so the network's always having to correct its own errors. And so it naturally learns a self-correcting flow field. Yeah. Okay, I said, oh no, there first. Sorry, you've.
So a comment and then a question.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that guy left.
Yeah.
I wanted to push back a little bit. I mean, I get that these factors are real in the sense that there's some sort of like Fourier transform or eigenfunction that you can do that like results in these weights, falling out and being right. But like if you think about something abstracted like temperature,
Yeah.
Below that you really do have fundamental forces acting on molecules that we're looking at in a statistical manner and summing across
Yeah.
to produce these. While like for this factor, you're not necessarily saying that there's some underlying, like you don't have a mechanistic underlying understanding of it, which is not to say that there's not one possible.
I think we do, right? I mean, I think to the degree that we have an underlying mechanistic understanding of synapses and spikes, I mean, it's the exact same thing.
Okay.
Right? Or at least I'm going to try and claim that it is, or at least that it's fairly similar. Yeah, I mean, if you understand, I mean, I think it's fair to say, I mean, certainly in these models, we have a mechanistic understanding of their spikes and their synapses. I mean, they're simplified, but they're certainly mechanistic. And the factors are just linearly weighted sums of spikes where the weights come from the synapses, right? You don't actually get them via analysis. When you're analyzing data, you get them via a statistical method. But in these models, you know what the correct weights are. They come from analyzing the synapses. So you're like analyzing real things, synapses, spikes, and then the factors are well-defined in terms of those underlying things. So I think it is well-grounded. And now it's not well-grounded. Not every network will use this abstraction, but then temperature isn't well-defined, I don't think. You can correct me if I'm wrong, far from equilibrium. So, like an abstraction can be great. It doesn't mean it works all the time. But
then the second question I was going to really ask then was, so in your kind of final slide, you showed that you had these different tracks. In your mind, how does that work for like translatability of skills?
Yeah.
So learning a new skill,
yeah.
how do you like establish a new flow state where you've now separated and distinguished?
That's the experiment that's been going on this week.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I mean, a few people, I mean, you must have a good institute because a few people have asked me that same question today. And it's one that we're very interested in. Like, maybe sometimes you learn new skills completely de novo. Like I tried to learn the bass recently. Like I've never done anything like that before. It's painstaking, it's horrible, especially if you're me. But like most of our skills kind of get split off from other skills. Like, you've never played cricket before, but you've played baseball. So you can use your baseball skills for cricket. Or maybe you can even use your baseball skills for wood chopping. But then once you're an expert, like maybe your wood chopping skills and your baseball skills are now more or less independent. You can adapt one without impacting the other, for example. So yeah, we're very interested in this. Like when you're forced to learn something new, but it's related to something you've done before, like, do you use your existing skill to do it badly? And then over time, create two new skills such that you can go back and forth and be an expert at both. And those like literally are experiments that are ongoing right now. Yeah, yeah. Thank you for your patience, by the way.
Thank you for the talk. So my question is, how do you think about factors? Do you think they arise as a result of the redundancy in the recurrent connectivity of motor cortex, or just does that mean that there is redundancy in the connection from higher level areas to motor cortex so that they control those factors?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I would say, I hope I can give a good answer. I guess I would say, like, if these networks they need signals in them that are meaningful to do anything meaningful, right? Like, if I'm going to be producing a sinusoid as an output, somewhere inside me has to be a sinusoid, right? That signal's got to be in there. And for the reasons discussed with tangling, if I'm going to have a sine, I'm also going to have a cosine. So there's going to have to be these meaningful signals hiding in the activity of the neurons. And in the inputs of the neurons, right, each neuron is going to have to be feeling from all of the other neurons the meaningful signals that are flowing through the network connectivity. And if I'm listening to a million other neurons, there's a million different linear combinations of their activity I could be feeling, and some subset of those are meaningful. And I would just say that the factors are the meaningful subset. And in some sense, if you think about it that way, well, like, of course the computations, I don't mean to agree too much with the earlier comment, but of course the computations are performed at the level of the factors. They're the only meaningful signals flowing through the recurrent connectivity of the network. Everything else is noise, right? So at least for a certain class of network, I think, yeah, that's how I like to think about it. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, actually, last one.
Thank you. Yeah, so my question basically along the same line. So regarding like the low rank connectivity matrix, there are different ways of interpreting those. Some you can interpret it as the local connectivity is low rank, or you can interpret it as like a feed-forward to some high level and feedback, and that could make different biological predictions. Like, can you find like high level factor neurons or not? If there's something.
Yeah, I mean, I think in this case, I mean, the total connectivity when we're done is not low rank, right? Because it's a combination of a random component plus a low rank component. I suspect that things don't really need to be low rank. And in fact, in some sense, they almost can't be. So Brian de Pasquale also trained versions of this that respect Dale's law and where connectivity is sparse. And as soon as you add those constraints, you cannot be low rank anymore. But so the low rank version is the version where it's easiest to understand what's going on. But there are cases where the connectivity is very high rank, and in fact, they're the more realistic cases. But it's still sort of effectively low rank, right? Like you still get this phenomenon where, yeah, you've got 1,000 neurons, but there's only, 10 meaningful signals flowing through the recurrent. And I'm not sure I fully wrap my head around that or why that works yet. Yeah.
Sorry, because we're in this slide, I
Yeah.
was wondering, how do you think about speed modulation? So if I learn something at one particular speed,
Yeah.
I can often, speed it up and slow it down, but this is dynamics, right? Here, time and sort of motor implementation are indeed entangled, right?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think, so Bensei's pointing out a deficiency with this perspective, and I think correctly, that, so in this case, like we know this is really what we see, right? Like this is exactly what the data really looks like. And there's this speed axis here. And, if you train a neural network, like this is the solution it comes up with too. So great, we feel really good about ourselves. But then, like as Bensei said, like maybe there's an action that I've only ever done slowly or only ever done at a medium speed, but I can speed it up. And we all know that when practicing, say the piano, that's a common strategy, right? Learn when it's slow and speed it up. So that would sort of like imply there was like a speeded up axis that was like common across all movements. And that's a little hard to imagine in this view, right? Because like, is this speed axis for this task Is it also going to be the speed axis for other tasks? That kind of seems unlikely. I don't know. It's a really good question. I don't think I have a good answer. And I've wondered the same thing and felt lost. Like, you know, maybe the speeding it up is kind of like in the earlier question where like sometimes maybe motor cortex is getting a lot of guidance from SMA, from PFC. And that's like the juncture in learning where SMA is like, okay, like the signals I was sending, now I'm going to send the same signals, but faster. And then motor cortex just follows along. And then later you sort of get to this crystalline stage here.
This scheme, I have to learn each speed.
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's a problem because in this scheme, you have to learn each one separately. But maybe it's not so bad. So like, here's something we definitely notice in the monkeys. In fact, we're noticing it in the experiments just this week, where they've been trained to go at every speed from 0.5 hertz up to the fastest they can go, which is very monkey dependent, but let's say 3 hertz, right? And then we surprise them with a new physics on the pedal that they've never seen before. They could still do it. They're kind of bad and they don't get as much juice, but they can still do it at the lower speeds, but they fail utterly. Like they literally, if they could hit 3 hertz before, now they can't get above 2.4 hertz. They try their hardest and then they just like give up. So I think like there is some external thing that we're just not modeling here that says speed up, slow down. But then there is also some of the thing that you were just criticizing. I think like, you're right, that can't be the only thing, but I do think that exists as well, where you're like, I've never done this speed before, but now I'm learning to do it. I've never gone at 3 hertz. And so there's got to be some combination of a higher area pushing you up to that speed, and then like learning like within motor cortex or the motor cortex basal ganglia loop or the motor cortex cerebellar loop or whatever it is, that's like, okay, you know, PFC, you pushed me to do this, and I'm going to learn over the course of a few days how to, because that is roughly how long it takes, how to do it. But I grant you it's a bit of a mystery. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Yeah. There are still people raising hands, but I'm gonna let you, I don't want to.
It'd be fun, we can keep going if people.
I mean, you know me, I will not shut up. It's fine. Yeah.
Thank you. I have a very similar question to that. Instead of speed, in a more like generalization perspective, if you learn climb upstairs like 45 degrees, then what about stairs at 60?
Yeah, I think you guys are asking really deep questions, and it is really closely related. And I think it's a really good point. I think like the next 20 years of our field should be trying to answer questions like that, right? Because it's like, we can do mild generalization with this, right? Like if you've learned 1 hertz, 2 hertz, and 3 hertz, you can absolutely do anything between that. The networks can do that. You could do things like a ramp up and a ramp down of speed. So like these networks can generalize, but only in like these really limited ways. And you're right that like as people, we seem much better than that, right? Like we can push ourselves to a speed we've never done before, or we can do a bad job of some movement that we've never done before and then get good at it. And I don't feel like this framework really explains that, right? Like there's got to be some extra thing you add on to this, because I think it's right, but I don't think it's enough. Like you need some extra thing that sort of says like, how can your prefrontal cortex reach in and be like, okay, like you're good at baseball, and now you're going to use that for chopping wood, but like you're going to have to go over your head and come down on the object. Like, I don't feel like that's captured here. And I think you're right to point out that that's missing. And it's a place I'd like our research to go. Yeah. If I'm willing, if there, but I mean, yeah.
There is a framework also of unentangling that the input angle and then it becomes more straight.
Yeah.
That can help prediction of
Yeah.
So in these tasks, is there a way that the curvatures get more, like the trajectories get less curved? The simpler the task is to predict what you have to do next, or this is like not related at all?
Bill Newsom yelled at me for calling it tangling because he said it was going to be confusing because there was already a meaning of that word in the visual literature. So I still really like the word. in all our papers, we always call it trajectory tangling in order to make it clear. It's not the same. And I actually think this is a more intuitive use of the word tangling. But yeah, I think it's related only very distantly to the notion in vision. Yeah.
Like, there is no relationship of the curvature or tangling of these trajectories, for example, from beginning of learning.
Oh, that's a great question.
Or, like,
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really, I really, really like that question. And it's one that we tried to get at once in the past. So what you would really kind of expect, and actually it kind of relates to the earlier part of the conversation, right? Like when you're pushed to do something you're not good at yet, you might expect that your trajectories, I mean, they can't literally cross because then everything would be messed up, but they might be quite tangled, either because they're just not optimized well, or because you're relying heavily on inputs from other areas to do the task until you get good at it, and then you can kind of minimize that. So I think this was what was in your head. You might expect things to be pretty tangled early on, and then as you get really good and noise robust, the tangling would go down. The one time we tried to look at that, it seemed like the tangling was low right away, but the monkey also, like, we weren't really challenging him very much. And there's been historically, it's been hard to get them to do something truly new because they get very confused. Monkeys are always learning how to do something at the same time that they're learning what to do. And if they start to fail, they think they're wrong about what to do. And they like they're like, oh, I'm wrong. I should instead be doing this totally other thing, right? And so you have to convince them, no, you're doing the right thing. You're just not good at it yet. Keep going. And our latest task, I think maybe we've kind of finally solved that. Like he knows what his goal is. He's just like, why did the physics of this object just change? This is horrible. But he's not confused about what he should be doing. And so I'm hoping we can answer your question with that data. Yeah.
I attacked your thing earlier, but now I'm going to defend your thinking.
Okay.
So I mean, in terms of the speeding up or slowing down thing, I think that's very recoverable if you think about this as like a discrete vector field. And what I mean by that is you just multiply your vector field. Like however big your vector is moving along it, you have some scalar and that vector gets larger, that moves you along it. And likewise, if it's a discrete vector field or you have noise in that it's very easy. You can imagine that if you scale that too far, then that's going to push you out of your normal trajectory. And you're now in a space where you don't know how to handle that. You're outside of that vector field.
Yeah.
And so I think that would work perfectly well with.
Yeah, I think that's very reasonable. I think it's just some higher area would have to sort of know what direction to push in. And it would have to know that even if you'd only ever done it at one speed in the past. I mean, at this point, and so like, you can imagine that working really well if it's always the same direction that causes the scaling you're talking about. And Bensei's concern, which I kind of share, is that like maybe that's not plausible. I don't know. But I do think these are like the good next questions for our field. Like, how do you do something like speed up something you've already done before, but you've never done it fast? How do you do a new variant of a skill? How do you create a new skill out of an existing skill?
One thing I would say even more is it would explain why certain monkeys scale easier is because if they, let's say, I mean, they've settled on some localized vector field that's some approximation of whatever true function is. If their approximation is slightly worse than another monkey, as you do that scale, they're more likely to fall out of that vector.
And just fail. Yeah.
So explains that.
That's very plausible. I agree. Yeah.
Thank you.